When I bought my house in Willowbrook Estates, I thought I was getting the American dream. Manicured lawns, friendly neighbors, and property values that would make my realtor weep tears of joy. What I didn't know was that I was also getting Karen Pemberton, the HOA president who would make my life a living nightmare over a few dandelions. But as they say, revenge is a dish best served cold, and mine was absolutely glacial. Let me paint you a picture of Karen. 5 foot 2 inches of pure suburban fury, always clutching her laminated HOA rulebook like it was the Constitution itself. She drove a white SUV with custom license plates that read HOA Queen, because apparently subtlety wasn't in her vocabulary. Karen had been president of our homeowners association for 6 years running, not because people loved her, but because nobody else wanted to deal with the paperwork and the constant complaints from residents about her ridiculous enforcement policies. My first encounter with Karen happened exactly 3 days after I moved in. I was still unpacking boxes when I heard the distinctive click-clack of high heels on my driveway. Karen always wore heels, even when walking around the neighborhood conducting her inspections. I opened the door to find her standing there with a clipboard, looking like she'd just discovered a war crime in progress. Good morning. I'm Karen Pemberton, your HOA president. I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood and also inform you that your garbage cans are positioned incorrectly. She said this with the kind of smile that probably made small children hide behind their mothers. According to Section 4.7 of our CC and RS, garbage containers must be placed exactly 18 inches from the curb, not 16, not 20. 18. I looked at my garbage cans, which were maybe 2 inches off from her arbitrary measurement. Thanks for letting me know, Karen. I'll move them right away. I figured it was easier to comply than argue over something so trivial. Boy, was I wrong about that strategy. Over the next few weeks, Karen found fault with everything. My mailbox was half an inch too tall. My car was parked 3 degrees off from perpendicular in my own driveway. I received a formal violation notice because my porch light was supposedly too bright, even though it was the same wattage as every other house on the street. Each infraction came with a $25 fine and a passive-aggressive note about maintaining community standards. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late April. I was getting ready for work when I heard the dreaded click-clack approaching. Through my window, I watched Karen march across my front yard like a general inspecting troops, stopping to examine every blade of grass with forensic precision. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of something, muttering to herself and shaking her head dramatically. 20 minutes later, I found the violation notice tucked under my windshield wiper. My heart sank as I read the header. Severe landscaping violation, immediate compliance required. The fine amount made my coffee cup slip from my hands. $500. For weeds. According to Karen's detailed report, my front yard contained approximately 17 dandelions, for clover patches, and numerous other unauthorized plant species that constitute a serious threat to neighborhood aesthetic standards. She had photographed each offending plant with the dedication of a crime scene investigator, complete with a ruler for scale. The most infuriating part was the timeline. I had 72 hours to remove every single weed and reseed the affected areas, or face additional daily fines of $50. And here's the kicker. The violation was dated for a Saturday, but she didn't deliver it until Tuesday, meaning I technically only had 24 hours left to comply. That evening, I decided to do some research. If Karen wanted to play hardball with the HOA rules, I was going to learn them better than she did. I spent the entire night reading through our community's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, along with state laws governing homeowners associations. What I discovered was fascinating. Karen had been operating our HOA like her personal fiefdom, but she'd been cutting quite a few legal corners along the way. For starters, fines over $50 required approval from the entire board, not just the president. She also hadn't been following proper notification procedures, and several of her rules weren't actually in our official documents at all. But the real gold mine was buried in Section 12 of our CC and RS. Any HOA board member who knowingly violates association rules or misappropriates funds could be immediately removed from office and held personally liable for damages. I had a feeling Karen's rule enforcement might not hold up under scrutiny. The next morning, I called in sick to work and started my investigation in earnest. I knocked on doors throughout the neighborhood, asking residents about their experiences with Karen and the HOA. What I learned was eye-opening. Mrs. Rodriguez from Maple Lane had been fined $300 for having the wrong shade of white paint on her shutters. The Johnsons were hit with a $200 penalty because their teenage son's car was apparently too old and unsightly for the neighborhood, even though it was a perfectly maintained 2010 Honda. The Chins received a violation notice for their holiday decorations being up one day past the arbitrary deadline Karen had set. But here's where it got interesting. None of these residents had received proper notification of HOA board meetings where these rules were supposedly voted on. In fact, according to state law, major rule changes required a 30-day notice period and a formal vote by all homeowners, not just Karen's rubber stamp board. I spent the afternoon at the county courthouse, pulling records on our HOA's financial filings and board meeting minutes. What I found made my jaw drop. Karen had been holding emergency board meetings with just herself and one other member present, passing new rules and fine structures without proper quorum or homeowner input. Even worse, the financial records showed some serious discrepancies in how fine money was being spent. According to the official budget, HOA funds were supposed to go toward landscaping, snow removal, and community maintenance. But Karen had been using fine money to pay for her own pet projects, including a $1,500 neighborhood beautification consultation from a company that turned out to be owned by her brother-in-law. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to set my trap. I paid the $500 weed fine, but I also requested a formal hearing to dispute it, which was my right under both HOA rules and state law. Karen couldn't refuse without opening herself up to even more legal problems. The hearing was scheduled for the following Saturday at the community center. Karen probably thought it would be a simple rubber stamp affair where she could publicly humiliate me in front of the other board members and maybe scare a few more residents into compliance. She had no idea what was coming. Saturday arrived, and I showed up to the community center with a briefcase full of documentation and a smile that would have made the Cheshire Cat proud. Karen was already there, holding court with the other two board members and looking supremely confident. She'd even dressed for the occasion in a power suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. Well, Karen announced as I walked in. I'm glad you decided to accept responsibility for your violations. This hearing is really just a formality before we discuss your payment plan for the fine. Actually, Karen, I replied, setting my briefcase on the table. I'm here to formally dispute the fine and request a full audit of HOA finances and procedures. The color drained from Karen's face like someone had pulled a plug. That's completely unnecessary. The violation is clearly documented. Oh, I'm sure it is, I said, opening my briefcase and pulling out a thick folder. But I've done some research into our HOA's operations, and I've discovered some fascinating discrepancies. What followed was the most beautiful 15 minutes of my adult life. I systematically dismantled every aspect of Karen's fine, starting with the fact that she'd never properly noticed the rule changes that established the $500 penalty structure. I presented evidence that her inspections violated our community's privacy policies and that her selective enforcement constituted harassment under state law. But the real knockout punch came when I revealed the financial irregularities. Karen's face went from pale to green as I detailed how she'd been misappropriating HOA funds and holding illegal board meetings. The other board members looked like they wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. These are serious allegations, stammered Bob Mitchell, the board treasurer who clearly had no idea what Karen had been doing with the finances. We'll need to investigate this immediately. Actually, I said with my biggest smile yet. I've already filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office. They're very interested in HOA misconduct cases, especially ones involving financial impropriety. Karen's hands started shaking as she clutched her precious rulebook. You can't do this. I've dedicated years of my life to this community. Everything I've done has been for the good of the neighborhood. Karen, I replied calmly, you've been operating this HOA like your personal kingdom, violating state laws, and stealing from your neighbors. The good news is that you're about to have a lot more free time to reflect on your choices. The emergency board meeting that followed was swift and decisive. Faced with potential criminal liability and a state investigation, the other board members voted unanimously to remove Karen from her position as president and launch a full audit of HOA finances. As the gavel came down on her reign of suburban terror, Karen's face crumpled in absolute shock and disbelief. "This can't be happening," she whispered, staring at the table where her laminated rulebook lay forgotten. "I am the HOA president. I am the HOA president." But she wasn't anymore, and the look of complete devastation on her face as that reality sank in was worth every dandelion in my front yard.